The bell rang before dawn. Not the bright, celebratory peal used for weddings or festivals. This bell was slow, measured, heavy. It cut through the narrow streets like a warning meant only for those already awake. Florence stirred, but did not rise. Shutters stayed closed. Candles flickered behind stone walls. Somewhere, footsteps echoed and then vanished. The city had learned to listen before it spoke. Imagine standing inside Florence at that hour. The air cool. The sky pale and undecided. Marble churches looming like watchful witnesses. This was not the Florence of postcards and paintings. Not yet. By day, the city dazzled. Gold leaf. Frescoes. Silk moving through markets like flowing water. Wealth announced itself loudly here, as if afraid of silence. Bankers walked beside priests. Artists ate at the tables of princes. Beauty was currency. Power was performance. But beneath it all, Florence trembled. It trembled because it knew itself too well. The city was rich and afraid of judgment. Devout and addicted to excess. Proud of its genius, and secretly convinced it had gone too far. Florence prayed often. Not gently. Urgently. Churches overflowed, not with peace, but with bargaining. Candles were lit for forgiveness that never quite arrived. Confessions were spoken quickly, as if outrunning consequence. Few people today understand what the city feared. It was not invasion. Not famine. Not even death. Florence feared corruption seen too clearly. Every triumph cast a shadow. Every painting of saints shared the city with gambling halls, courtesans, and quiet cruelty. Men praised God in the morning and cheated him by night, and somehow believed both could last forever. That belief was beginning to crack. There were signs. Whispers, mostly. A bad harvest here. A child dying suddenly there. Rumors of wars God no longer restrained. People began to talk about punishment. Not metaphorical punishment. Real punishment. Fire from the heavens. Plagues carried by angels. A reckoning delayed, but no longer denied. Florence had always loved preachers. It loved words. Loved the sound of meaning arranged beautifully. But now it wanted something different. Not comfort. Not elegance. It wanted certainty. In the shadows of cloisters and convents, a new kind of sermon began to circulate, not yet from the pulpit, but from memory. Words repeated in hushed tones. Prophecies spoken as if already fulfilled. God was angry. God was watching. God would cleanse. The idea spread quietly, like heat through stone. And somewhere within the city, a monk listened. At this moment, Girolamo Savonarola was no one Florence feared. No one powerful. Barely noticed. He walked its streets without escort. A tall, gaunt figure in simple robes. Eyes too intense for casual conversation. He watched the city with the patience of someone convinced time itself was running out. Florence did not yet hear him. But it was preparing itself to listen. Because the city sensed a contradiction it could no longer resolve. It wanted salvation, but without sacrifice. Purity, but without loss. Forgiveness, without fire. And Florence had always believed it could have everything. The Medici ruled with velvet hands, their power softened by patronage and art. They filled the city with beauty, and beauty softened resistance. But beauty also distracted. It taught Florence to look away from its own reflection. That reflection was becoming unbearable. A city cannot live forever on appearances. Sooner or later, it must decide what it truly believes. Faith, in Florence, had become something uneasy. Less devotion than anxiety. Less love than fear of being found out. What happens when faith becomes fear? The question hovered over the city like smoke before flame. People began to attend sermons not to feel uplifted, but to feel warned. They leaned forward when preachers spoke of wrath. They remembered every earthquake, every rumor of disaster, every unexplained death. They wanted someone to say the quiet truth out loud. And somewhere in the darkness before dawn, a bell rang again. Not because the city was ready, but because something was coming. Florence did not yet know the name of the man who would speak its guilt back to it. It did not yet know the cost of listening. For now, the city slept uneasily, surrounded by beauty, haunted by suspicion. A fire had not been lit, but the wood was already stacked. The warning came to him in silence. Not thunder. Not a voice from the sky. Just a pressure behind the eyes, heavy and unrelenting, as if the air itself had thickened. Girolamo Savonarola knelt alone in his cell while the city slept. The walls were bare. The floor cold. A single candle burned low, its flame wavering as though uncertain it should remain. He did not ask for visions. They arrived anyway. He saw cities collapsing inward. Crowds scattering like ash. Altars overturned. Thrones left empty. Always the same feeling followed, certainty without comfort. Savonarola had been raised on order. Discipline. Rules that made the world feel stable. But these warnings did not feel orderly. They felt urgent. Impatient. As if time itself were losing patience with Florence. Few noticed him then. In the convent, he was known for intensity, not charm. His voice was rough. His face severe. He lacked the polish Florence admired. He did not flatter. He did not soften his words. And Florence liked its words softened. He read scripture not for beauty, but for judgment. Not for reassurance, but for consequence. Where others found metaphor, he found accusation. Night after night, the warnings returned. Not images alone, but conviction. That Florence was marked. That its beauty had become a disguise. That God would no longer look away. Imagine being certain of something no one else can see. Imagine believing the future has already been decided and realizing you are meant to speak it. That belief does something to a man. Savonarola began to fast longer. Sleep less. Pray with a desperation that unsettled those who heard him. He did not speak of love first. He spoke of decay. Florence, he believed, was rotting from abundance. Its art had become vanity. Its wealth had become insult. Its faith had become performance. God, in Savonarola's mind, was not distant. God was offended. When he finally began to preach publicly, his words landed awkwardly at first. They did not flow. They struck. People shifted on stone benches. They glanced at one another, uneasy. This was not how sermons usually sounded. He spoke of punishment as inevitable. Of repentance as insufficient if it was polite. Of fire not as symbol, but as tool. Some laughed quietly. Some frowned. Many ignored him. But a few listened differently. They felt something tighten in their chest when he spoke. Not fear exactly. Recognition. As if someone had finally named the dread they carried without language. Savonarola did not describe Florence as wicked in general. He described it precisely. Its bankers. Its courtesans. Its princes who hid behind patronage. He named sins without naming names, and somehow everyone felt exposed. Religion, in his mouth, became less shelter and more spotlight. What made his warnings dangerous was not volume, but certainty. He did not argue. He declared. There was no debate in his tone. No curiosity. Only urgency, sharpened by belief. He spoke as though time were closing, as though Florence were standing on the edge of something it could not step back from. People began to repeat his words outside the church. Quietly at first. Then with emphasis. A monk is saying the city will burn. A monk is saying God is finished waiting. A monk is saying beauty will not save us. Others dismissed him as unbalanced. Too severe. Too certain. But certainty has gravity. Florence was already anxious. Already suspicious of its own splendor. Savonarola's warnings did not create fear, they gave it shape. And shape is contagious. Soon, his sermons drew larger crowds. Not because they were pleasant, but because they were different. People did not leave uplifted. They left unsettled. And they came back. Savonarola himself did not seem pleased by the attention. If anything, it deepened his severity. As if the growing audience confirmed his worst suspicions. If they were listening now, it meant time was short. At night, he returned to his cell and wrote feverishly. Predictions. Condemnations. Appeals that sounded less like prayer and more like testimony. He believed God had chosen him not because he was great but because he was willing. That belief would harden him. Florence had not yet decided what Savonarola was. Prophet. Fanatic. Warning. But something had shifted. The city had heard a voice it could not easily forget. And in the quiet spaces between sermons, between bells, between sleep and waking, Florence began to wonder. What if he is right? The thought did not announce itself. It settled. Like dry wood stacked carefully, waiting. The fire was still unlit. But someone had struck the match. The crowd did not speak. They packed the church long before sunrise, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath arches darkened by centuries of incense. Breath hung in the cold air. Candles trembled, throwing restless shadows across stone faces. No one smiled. They were waiting for a voice that no longer comforted, only warned. Savonarola stepped into the pulpit without ceremony. No flourish. No greeting. He looked out over Florence as if counting its sins one by one. And then he spoke. His words did not rise. They pressed down. He spoke of a city weighed and measured. Of a God no longer amused by elegance. Of judgment not postponed, but already moving. The effect was immediate. Men who negotiated fortunes flinched. Women who sponsored altars lowered their eyes. Even priests shifted uneasily, unsure whether they were listeners or accused. This was not preaching as Florence understood it. This was accusation disguised as prophecy. Savonarola did not shout. He did not need to. He spoke with the calm of someone delivering a verdict already sealed. Each sentence felt final. Each pause felt deliberate, as if daring the room to breathe. He described fire, not metaphorical fire, not poetic flame, but consuming fire. Fire that stripped away pretense. Fire that revealed what wealth and beauty had concealed. Some in the crowd felt relief. If judgment was coming, then uncertainty would end. If punishment was real, then fear had meaning. Others felt something colder. Because Savonarola's words did not point outward to enemies, invaders, distant evils. They turned inward. Toward homes. Toward habits. Toward private indulgences no confession had erased. Religion, in his voice, became intimate and invasive. Imagine standing there, surrounded by neighbors, while a stranger names the thoughts you never said aloud. That is when men began to tremble. Not from fear of death, but from recognition. Savonarola spoke of Florence as a chosen city that had betrayed its calling. Chosen not for beauty, but for responsibility. And responsibility, once abandoned, invited consequence. The crowd listened in silence because silence felt safer than disagreement. Outside the church, word spread quickly. Not about elegance of language. About severity. A monk is saying God will tear the city down. A monk is saying wealth is proof of guilt. A monk is saying repentance without sacrifice is a lie. The Medici heard these rumors with growing irritation. They had tolerated critics before. Florence always produced them. But Savonarola did not mock power, he denied its legitimacy. He did not argue policy. He questioned worthiness. That made him dangerous. Still, the crowds grew. They came not because they enjoyed the sermons, but because they feared missing them. Because not hearing felt riskier than listening. Because if God was speaking, absence might count as defiance. Savonarola began to sense the shift. His words were no longer falling into uncertainty. They were shaping it. He spoke more boldly. More precisely. He described Florence's art as vanity dressed as devotion. Its festivals as sin disguised as celebration. Its leaders as caretakers of corruption. Each accusation sharpened the divide. Some left the church pale and shaken, whispering prayers they had not spoken in years. Others left furious, muttering that the monk had gone too far. But even the angry ones returned. Because outrage, too, is a form of attention. Faith and fear began to blur. Was Savonarola warning Florence or commanding it? The line was not clear. He insisted he was only a messenger. But messengers who speak with certainty often become authorities. An authority, once granted, is difficult to withdraw. Florence had asked for clarity. Savonarola gave it. And clarity, stripped of mercy, can feel like cruelty. Behind the scenes, alliances began to shift. Some clerics resented his influence. Some politicians feared it. Others wondered if it could be used. Savonarola seemed uninterested in such calculations. Or unwilling to acknowledge them. He believed obedience mattered more than survival. That belief hardened his voice. The sermons became less warning than demand. Change or burn. Florence began to respond. Not yet with action. With attention. Eyes followed Savonarola through streets. Conversations stopped when he passed. People began to measure their lives against his words and against one another. Judgment was no longer distant. It was communal. And once judgment becomes shared, it begins to move. On one morning, as the sermon ended, no one applauded. No one spoke. The crowd rose slowly, as if released from something heavy. Savonarola remained where he was, watching them go. He had said what he believed God demanded. Now Florence would decide what to do with it. The church doors closed behind the last listener. Outside, the city waited, quiet, divided, attentive. The words had been spoken. And somewhere in Florence, a decision began forming, not shouted, not declared, but agreed upon in silence. The bells rang again. Not in celebration. Not in grief. They rang with purpose. Florence woke to the sound and understood instinctively that something had shifted. Bells had always marked time here, prayer, market, feast. But this ringing felt different. It did not invite. It summoned. People moved through the streets more quietly now. Conversations lowered. Laughter became rare. Even the colors of the city seemed muted beneath winter light. Fear had learned to walk openly. Savonarola did not command the bells. He did not need to. His words had already done their work. Imagine standing in Florence at dawn and realizing the city is watching itself. Neighbors glance longer. Doors close sooner. A glance lingers on a silk sleeve, a painted face, a display of wealth. What once impressed now accused. Florence had always lived with sin, but it had never measured it so carefully. Now every indulgence felt like evidence. Every pleasure felt recorded. Fear is efficient that way. The sermons continued, and with them, certainty hardened. Savonarola spoke less of warning and more of responsibility. If punishment was coming, it could still be redirected if Florence proved worthy. Proved obedient. People wanted instructions. What must we give up? What must we destroy? What must be burned? Savonarola's answers were never detailed, never gentle. He spoke of purity as alignment, not compromise. Of sacrifice as proof, not performance. Florence filled in the rest. Suddenly, restraint became virtue. Excess became suspect. Art, once untouchable, was questioned. Not openly at first. quietly, as if even doubt might be overheard. Children began to repeat Savonarola's phrases in the streets. Simple words. Sharp words. Words about sin and fire. Parents corrected them, then hesitated and fell silent. Something was happening. Faith had left the church and entered the home. This was the moment Florence crossed a line it could not see. Fear, once private, became shared. People began to watch one another not out of malice, but duty. Correction felt righteous. Suspicion felt holy. To question Savonarola now seemed like questioning God's patience. And patience, he insisted, was nearly gone. Those in power felt the pressure first. The Medici had ruled Florence by making it feel generous. They funded beauty, rewarded loyalty, and softened authority with celebration. But Savonarola offered a different vision of leadership, one where virtue mattered more than lineage. He did not challenge the Medici directly. He made them irrelevant. Florence began to imagine itself purified without them. That imagination frightened everyone. Supporters gathered around Savonarola not as followers, but as guardians. They listened closely, interpreted quickly, acted eagerly. Some saw themselves as defenders of the city. Others as instruments of cleansing. None saw themselves as dangerous. Religion had become a weapon without being named as one. What happens when belief no longer asks permission? Florence began to choose fear because fear felt safer than uncertainty. Fear provided rules. Fear offered clarity. Fear promised salvation through obedience. Love requires trust. Fear requires action. And action was coming. Those who resisted Savonarola's influence did so quietly. A joke here. A complaint there. But even dissent felt risky now. Words traveled faster than expected. Silence felt safer than honesty. Enemies began to gather, not openly, but carefully. In private rooms. In measured conversations. Political, religious, personal. No one moved first. Because everyone sensed the balance was fragile. Savonarola himself seemed unmoved by resistance. If anything, it confirmed his certainty. Opposition, to him, was proof. Resistance was evidence that the fire was necessary. He believed Florence had chosen. And in a way, it had. Not through a vote. Not through decree. Through behavior. Through what people stopped doing. Through what they began to hide. Through what they were willing to surrender. Florence had not yet burned anything. But it had already decided something must be burned. The city no longer asked whether Savonarola was right. It asked how far obedience should go. As dusk settled one evening, a small crowd gathered, not for a sermon, not for prayer. Just to talk. Quietly. Carefully. About things that no longer felt safe to keep. Objects. Images. Luxuries. Things that once defined Florence. No fire was lit that night. But as the crowd dispersed, a shared understanding followed them into the dark. The city had chosen fear. And fear, once chosen, does not easily let go. Somewhere beyond the bells and the whispers, a line had been crossed. And Florence did not look back. The fire was built before anyone spoke of lighting it. It stood in the center of the square like a silent promise, wood stacked carefully, deliberately, higher than necessary. It did not crackle. It did not smoke. It waited. Around it, Florence gathered. Not as a mob. As witnesses. Imagine standing there in the pale morning light. The air sharp. The crowd unusually quiet. No music. No laughter. Just the soft sound of movement, of objects being carried forward and placed at the base of the pile. At first, the offerings were modest. A mirror. A deck of painted cards. A book closed carefully, as if apologizing. People stepped back after each contribution, uncertain whether to feel relief or shame. This was not destruction yet. It was confession. Savonarola was present, but not central. He did not light the fire. He did not shout commands. His authority now lived elsewhere, in the minds of those who had come. That was the most dangerous part. The bonfire was never announced as violence. It was framed as cleansing. Objects that had once defined Florence's pride were redefined as threats. Fine clothes that signaled status. Paintings that stirred desire. Instruments that made bodies move instead of kneel. Vanity, Savonarola called it. And vanity, once named, became contagious. The pile grew. More people stepped forward, each act watched carefully by the crowd. To give nothing now felt conspicuous. To hesitate felt like defiance. Fear dressed itself as devotion. Children were brought to participate. They carried small items, taught to feel proud of surrender. Their voices echoed words they barely understood about purity, about obedience, about fire that pleased God. Some adults wept openly as they placed their possessions on the wood. Others did not. Some watched with hard eyes, calculating what this ritual might cost them or save them. A few stood at the edges, arms folded, saying nothing. Their silence was noted. Savonarola spoke briefly. Not to stir emotion, but to steady it. He described the fire not as punishment, but as mercy. A chance to prove Florence still listened. Still feared God enough to act. He did not mention art by name. He did not need to. The city understood what was being asked of it. What had once been unthinkable now felt necessary. As the fire was lit, it caught quickly. Dry wood. Dry cloth. Dry resolve. Flames climbed with frightening speed, licking at objects that had taken years to create. Gold leaf curled. Painted faces blackened. Pages shrank into ash. The crowd did not cheer. They watched. Some crossed themselves. Some closed their eyes. Some stared, unblinking. What happens when faith becomes fire? The answer rose in heat. The bonfire was not one moment. It was repetition. Days later, another. Then another. Each one larger. Each one bolder. What began as voluntary began to feel expected. Those who offered nothing were quietly questioned. Those who offered much were praised, not by Savonarola, but by the crowd itself. Righteousness was becoming visible. And visibility invites performance. Florence began to measure devotion by what could be burned. The more dramatic the sacrifice, the greater the proof. Artists watched their work vanish. Some convinced themselves it was right. Others swallowed their fury and said nothing. A few left the city altogether. Patrons smiled thinly as they surrendered objects they could replace, while watching carefully who could not. Enemies multiplied in silence. Savonarola's power peaked here, though he may not have realized it. He had reshaped the city's instincts. He had taught Florence to police itself. No army could have done that. But fire is honest. It consumes without distinction. As the smoke rose over Florence, doubts began to flicker, quietly, dangerously. Not about sin, but about control. About how easily devotion had turned into spectacle. Some began to wonder who decided what counted as vanity. Others noticed how fear lingered even after the flames died down. The city felt cleaner. But not calmer. Ash settled into streets and memory. And once something is burned publicly, it cannot be unburned. Florence had crossed another line. Not because objects were destroyed, but because the crowd had learned how easy it was to destroy them together. That knowledge did not fade with the smoke. As the square emptied and embers cooled, a few people lingered at the edges, staring at the blackened remains. No one spoke. But something unsteady had entered Florence now, something colder than fear. Doubt. The fire was over. But the silence it left behind was only beginning to spread. The crowd gathered again. But this time, they did not lean forward. They stood apart, arms crossed, voices low. The square felt larger now, emptier somehow. The fire pit was still there, dark and scarred, its presence no longer symbolic, just remembered. Ash has a way of lingering. Savonarola mounted the pulpit as he always had, his posture unchanged, his gaze unwavering. He spoke as though nothing essential had shifted. As though obedience, once given, could not be withdrawn. But Florence was changing. Imagine standing in the crowd and realizing the fear that once united you now feels unfamiliar. Not gone, but unstable. Less convincing. Less sacred. The sermons grew sharper. Savonarola warned that doubt itself was sin. That hesitation was betrayal. That God tested Florence still, and that those who resisted purification were revealing themselves. The message was clear. The fire had not gone far enough. That was when some people began to step back. Quietly at first. Then deliberately. The city had endured sacrifice. It had watched beauty burn. It had obeyed. And still, the warnings continued. Still, the threats grew heavier. If this was mercy, it felt endless. If this was salvation, it demanded too much. The question Florence had avoided now surfaced. When does purification become control? Savonarola's enemies sensed the shift before his followers did. They had waited patiently, allowing fear to exhaust itself. Now they whispered carefully, spreading uncertainty like a counter-sermon. Is this God speaking or a man who refuses to stop? How many fires will be enough? Who decides what burns next? The Medici, long patient, moved quietly through old networks. Clerics once cautious began to speak openly of restraint. Rome, distant but attentive, began to listen. Savonarola did not retreat. He doubled down. He spoke of Florence as chosen still, but now endangered by wavering faith. He warned that God punished not only corruption, but compromise. That word lingered. Compromise. It sounded like accusation. Supporters rallied around him more fiercely, interpreting every doubt as attack. They saw themselves as the last defenders of truth, surrounded by corruption returning from the shadows. The city fractured along invisible lines. Faith versus fear. Obedience versus exhaustion. Certainty versus silence. Savonarola believed resistance proved his righteousness. In his mind, opposition had always been the mark of prophecy fulfilled. But Florence was no longer listening with the same ears. The fires that once cleansed now reminded people of loss. The absence of art felt heavier than the sin it was meant to erase. The joy that once filled the city did not return, only vigilance. Fear had delivered obedience. It could not deliver peace. One morning, the bells rang, and fewer people came. The absence was noticeable. Savonarola spoke anyway. His words echoed through space that no longer pressed inward. The silence between sentences stretched longer than before. Where once there had been trembling, now there was calculation. This frightened him. Not openly. Not consciously. But his tone hardened. He spoke of betrayal. Of wolves within the flock. Of fire that would return not as mercy, but judgment. And Florence recoiled. Not in outrage. In weariness. The city had been asked to burn what it loved. Now it was being asked to burn its doubts. To surrender its conscience entirely. That was a step too far. Opposition moved faster now. Meetings in shadowed rooms. Agreements made without ceremony. Words chosen carefully to sound like concern, not rebellion. Savonarola was isolated without realizing it. He still commanded the pulpit. He no longer commanded the city. And yet, he could not stop. A man who believes God speaks through him cannot easily imagine being wrong. To retreat would mean admitting the voice had changed, or that it was never divine at all. That possibility was unthinkable. Florence sensed it. The fire had turned back. Not in flames, but in gaze. People began to watch Savonarola the way they once watched the pyres. Closely. Critically. Waiting for something to collapse. On a cold evening, as Savonarola left the church, a small group stood across the square. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They simply watched. He passed them without looking. But he felt it. The city he believed he was saving had begun to judge him. No fire burned that night. But something far more dangerous ignited. A quiet resolve. And Florence, once united by fear, was preparing to choose something else. The crowd watched without cheering. They had gathered early, pressed together beneath a gray sky that refused to decide what it would become. No bells rang this time. No sermons followed. Only the scrape of wood, the murmur of guards, the sound of breathing held too long. Savonarola stood at the center of it all. No pulpit now. No authority. Just a man. Imagine standing there, among the silent faces, and realizing how quickly certainty dissolves when fear changes direction. The same crowd that once trembled at his words now studied him with distance, as if he were a stranger who had stayed too long. He spoke once more. Not loudly. Not prophetically. The words were lost to the wind, swallowed by space and tension. Some strained to hear. Others looked away. This was not a sermon. It was an ending. The fire was prepared carefully. Not towering, not theatrical. Efficient. Controlled. The kind of fire meant to erase, not inspire. Savonarola had promised Florence purification through flame. Now Florence returned the promise. As the fire caught, it did not roar. It consumed steadily, without ceremony. Smoke curled upward, dark and patient, carrying with it the smell of wood and something older. Something final. Few cried out. Some prayed. Many watched in silence, uncertain what they were meant to feel. Fear had brought them here. Relief followed close behind. The city had been holding its breath for months. Now it exhaled. And yet, the silence lingered. Savonarola's body was reduced to ash, scattered so nothing could be gathered, nothing remembered too clearly. Florence was thorough. It wanted no relics. No martyrs. No reminders. Within days, the city began to change its tone. Art returned. Laughter softened the streets. Festivals resumed, careful at first, then with growing confidence. The Medici reclaimed their place. Order restored itself quietly, convincingly. Florence told itself the danger had passed. But ashes do not vanish simply because they are swept away. Few people today understand what Florence tried to forget. Not the man, but the mirror. Savonarola had not arrived as a conqueror. He had emerged from the city's own anxieties, its unspoken guilt, its hunger for certainty. He gave Florence the courage to burn what frightened it. Then Florence burned him instead. History struggled with what remained. Was he a prophet silenced too soon? A fanatic finally stopped? A warning misunderstood? The city preferred simpler answers. It rebuilt its beauty quickly. Paintings replaced those lost. Music filled the squares again. Florence returned to being admired, celebrated, for what it created, not what it destroyed. But something had shifted beneath the surface. A memory lingered. That belief, once inflamed, can remake a city. That righteousness, once unquestioned, can demand everything. That fear, when shared, becomes power. And power, once tasted, does not disappear easily. Imagine walking through Florence years later, admiring its art, its light, its confidence. Imagine standing in a square where tourists now gather, unaware of what once burned beneath their feet. The stones remember. They remember a time when a city chose fear over doubt. When it surrendered its conscience to certainty. When it learned how easily devotion could become destruction. Savonarola did not survive Florence. But neither did the Florence that believed fire could cleanse the soul without consequence. The ashes were scattered. The memory softened. The lesson remained unresolved. Because the question he forced upon the city never truly disappeared. What happens when faith becomes fire? Florence answered once and tried never to speak of it again. The city moved on. History watched. And somewhere, beneath the beauty, the silence still waits.